Flying Saucers by C.G. Jung, Part 2, Dream 4. When I was engaged on this paper, an acquaintance from abroad unexpectedly sent me a dream he had on May 27, 1957. Our relationship was limited to one letter each every 1 or 2 years. He was an amateur astrologer and was interested in the question of synchronicity. He knew nothing of my preoccupations with UFOs, nor did he connect his dream in any way with the theme that interested me. His sudden and unusual decision to send me the dream comes, rather, into the category of meaningful coincidences, which statistical prejudice dismisses as irrelevant. This is the dream. It was late afternoon or early evening, the sun low on the horizon. The sky was cloudy, and there was a veil of cloud over the sun, which did not, however, prevent one from seeing quite clearly his disk in outline behind the cloud. Under such circumstances the sun was white. Suddenly he took on an aspect of extraordinary pallor. The whole western horizon became a dreadful pale white, and the pallor is the word I want to stress, of the orb of day became a terrifying wanness. Then a second sun appeared in the west about the same distance above the horizon, only a little more to the north. But as we gazed intently at the sky, there were a great number of people spread over a wide area, watching the heavens as I was. The second sun took on the distinctive form of a sphere in contrast with the sun's disk, or apparent disk. Simultaneously with the setting of the sun and the advent of night, the sphere came speeding towards the earth. With the coming of the night, the whole potential of the dream was changed. Whereas words like pallor and wanness exactly describe the vanishing life, strength, and potential of the sun, the sky now assumed the aspect of strength and majesty, which inspired not fear but awe. I could not say that I saw any stars, but the night sky was of the kind when thin wreaths of cloud allow an occasional star to be seen. The night certainly spoke of majesty, power, and beauty. When the sphere approached the earth at high velocity, I thought at first it was Jupiter in aberration from its proper orbit, but as the sphere came nearer, I saw that, though large, it was much too small for Jupiter, and it now became possible to discern the markings on its surface, which were lines of longitude or such like, but were decorative and symbolic in character rather than geographical or mathematical. The beauty of the sphere, or a subdued gray or opaque white against the night sky, must be emphasized. When we became aware that the sphere must certainly make a terrific impact upon the earth, we did of course feel fear, but it was fear in which awe was more predominant. It was a most awe-inspiring cosmic phenomenon. As we gazed, another and yet another sphere emerged from the horizon and sped towards the earth. Each sphere did in turn crash much as a bomb would crash, but at such a considerable distance that I, at least, could not make out the nature of the explosion or detonation, or whatever it was. I think in one case, at least, I saw a flash. These spheres then were falling at intervals all around, and all of them well beyond the point at which they might annihilate us. There appeared to be a danger of shrapnel. Then I must have gone indoors, for I found myself talking to a girl seated in a wicker chair, with an open, large-page notebook on her lap, much engrossed in her work. We were going, the rest of us, I think, in a southwesterly direction, perhaps seeking safety, and I said to the girl that she had better not come with us. The danger appeared to be great, and we could hardly leave her alone there. She was quite definite in her reply. No, she would remain where she was and go on with her work. It was equally dangerous everywhere, and one place was just as safe as another. I saw at once that she had reason and common sense on her side. The dream ends by my being confronted with another girl, of quite possibly the same competent and self-possessed young lady that I had left sitting in the wicker chair absorbed in her work. This time she was rather bigger and more realistic, and I could see her face, or at least she was addressing me fairly and squarely. and she said in extraordinary distinct tones, "J.S., you will live till 11:8." Nothing could surpass the clarity with which the 8 words were articulated. Her authoritative way of enunciating them seemed to imply that I was to be censured for not supposing I should live until 11:8. Dreamer's commentary. This elaborate description is followed by the dreamer's comments, which can give us a number of hints as regards interpretation. As we should expect, he sees a climax in the sudden change of mood at the beginning of the dream, when the deathly frightening pallor and wanness of the sunset changes into the somber majesty of the night, and fear to awe. This, he said, was connected with his present preoccupation with the political future of Europe. On the basis of his astrological speculations, he feared the coming of the World War II in 1960 to 66. He had even felt impelled to write a letter. He feared the coming of a world war in 1960 to 1966, not World War II. He had even felt impelled to write a letter to an eminent statesman expressing his fears. Afterwards he made the not uncommon discovery that his previously apprehensive and agitated mood suddenly changed into one of remarkable calm and even indifference, as though the whole affair no longer concerned him. All the same, he could not explain to himself why the initial terror should be superseded by such a solemn and, as it were, holy mood. He felt certain, however, that it was a collective and not a personal matter, and he asked himself, are we to suppose that by hanging on too earnestly to the daylight of civilization we lose all potential, and that as we advance into what looks a fearful night, there is more prospect of strength? It is not very easy to fit the qualifying epithet of majesty into such an interpretation. He himself related to the fact that, quote, things that come from outer space are utterly beyond their control, unquote. Quote, we might put it in theistic language by saying that it is utterly impossible to know the counsels of God, and that in eternity the night is as significant as the day. Therefore, our only possible chance is to accept the rhythm of eternity as night and day, and so the inexorable majesty of the night would become a source of strength, unquote. Evidently, the dream underlies this characteristic, defeatism by the cosmic interlude of a stellar bombardment to which mankind is helplessly exposed. The dream contains no trace of sexuality if, as the dreamer said, we disregard the meaning of the young lady, as if every relationship to the opposite sex was always necessarily based on sexuality. What disturbed him was the fact that the meeting took place at night. One can carry sex consciousness too far, as this remark shows. The wicker chair is not exactly inviting in this respect, and for the dreamer it signified an excellent condition for concentrated mental work, as indicated by the notebook. As the dreamer is an ardent student of astrology, the combination of the number 11 and 8 set him a special problem. He thought of XI, 8, as the month and day of his dreams. Being an elderly man of more than 80 years and 10, he was thoroughly justified in such reflections. His astrological calculations led him to relegate this fatal November to the year 1963, middle of the conjectured World War, but he added cautiously that he was by no means sure. The dream, he said, left behind a strange feeling of contentment and of thankfulness that such an experience had been vouchsafed for him. It was indeed a big dream, for the like of which many a person has been thankful, even if they do not understand it correctly. Commentary to Dream 4. The dream begins with a sunset, when the sun is hidden by the clouds, so that all one can see is a disk. This would emphasize the round form, a tendency confirmed by the appearance of a second disk. Jupiter, more round bodies in large numbers, quote things from outer space. For this reason, the dream comes into the category of psychic UFO phenomenon. The uncanny pallor of the sun is indicative of the fear that spreads over the daylight world in anticipation of catastrophic events to come. These events, much in contrast to his, quote, daylight views, are of unearthly origin. Jupiter, the father of the gods, has left his orbit and is approaching the earth. We meet this motif in Schreber's memorials. The extraordinary happenings going on all around him compel God to, quote, move nearer to the earth, unquote. Here the unconscious, quote, interprets, unquote, threat of a divine intervention, which manifests itself in appearance of smaller replicas of the great Jupiter. The dreamer does not draw the obvious conclusion about UFOs and does not seem to have been influenced in his choice of symbols by any conscious concern with them. Although to all appearances a cosmic catastrophe is about to happen, the fear changes into a positive mood of a solemn, holy, and reverent kind, as is fitting for an epithet. For the dreamer, however, the coming of the gods signalizes extreme danger. The heavenly bodies explode on the earth like huge bombs, thus bearing out his fear of a world war. Remarkably enough, they do not cause the expected earthquake, and the detonation seems to be of a strange and unusual nature. No destruction takes place in the vicinity of the dreamer. The hits are so far below the horizon that all he thinks he can see is a single flash. The collision with these planetoids is therefore infinitely less dangerous than it would be in reality. The main point here seems to be fear of the possibility of a Third World War. It is this that gives the scene its terrifying aspect. It is the dreamer's own interpretation rather than the phenomenon itself which causes him to be so agitated. Consequently, the whole affair assumes a markedly psychological aspect. This is immediately borne out by the meeting with the young lady, who keeps her composure imperturbably goes on with her work and prophesies the date of his death. She does this in so solemn and impressive a manner that he even feels it necessary to emphasize the number of the words she uses, namely 8. That this figure is more than mere chance is proved by the supposed date of death, the 8th of November. The double emphasis on the 8 is not without importance, for 8 is a double quartany, and as an individuation symbol in the mandala, plays almost as great a role as the quartanity itself. And then footnote, in the Kabiri scene in Faust, Psychology and Alchemy, collected works, etc. Citation. End of footnote. For lack of association material, we shall suggest only a tentative interpretation of the number 11 with the help of traditional symbolism. 10 is the perfect unfolding of unity, and the numbers of 1 to 10 have the significance of a completed cycle. 10 plus 1 equals 11, therefore denotes the beginning of a new cycle. Since dream interpretation follows the principle of post hoc ergo propter hoc, 11 leads to 8, the Ogdad, a totality symbol, the Ogdoad, a totality symbol, and hence to a realization of wholeness, as already suggested by the appearance of the UFOs. The young lady, who seems to be unknown to the dreamer, may be taken as a compensating anima figure. She represents a more complete aspect of the unconscious than the shadow, since she adds to the personality its feminine traits. As a rule, she appears most clearly when the conscious mind is thoroughly acquainted with its shadow, and she exerts her great influence as a psychological factor when the feminine qualities of the personality are not yet integrated. If these opposites are not united, wholeness is not established, and the self as their symbol is still unconscious. But when the self is constellated, it appears in projection, though its true nature is hidden by the Anima, who at most alludes to it, and in this dream, the Anima, with her calmness and certainty, counters the agitation of the dreamer's ego consciousness, and by mentioning the number 8 points to the totality, the self, which is present in the UFO projection. The intuition of the enormous importance of the self as the organizer of the personality, and also as the collective dominance or archetypes, which so-called metaphysical principles determine the orientation of consciousness, is responsible for the solemn mood prevailing at the beginning of the dream. It is a mood in keeping with the coming of the epiphany, though it is feared that this will unleash a world war or a cosmic catastrophe. The Anima, however, seems to know better. Anyway, the expected destruction remains invisible, there being no real cause for alarm in the dreamer's vicinity except his own subjective panic. The Anima ignores his fear of a catastrophe and alludes instead to his own death, which we can say is the real source of his fear. Very often the nearness of death forcibly brings about a perfection that no effort will and no good intentions could achieve. He is the great perfecter, drawing his inexorable final line under the balance of human life. In him alone is wholeness, one way or another, attained. Death is the end of the empirical person and the goal of the spiritual person, as the perspicacious Heraclitus says, "It is to Hades that they rage and celebrate their feasts." Everything that is not yet where it ought to be, that has not yet gone where it ought to have gone, fears the end, the final reckoning. We avoid as long as possible making ourselves conscious of those things which wholeness still lacks, thus preventing ourselves from becoming conscious of the self and preparing for death. The self then remains in projection. In our dream it appears as Jupiter, which is approaching the earth, and changes into a multitude of smaller heavenly bodies, into numberless selves or individual souls, and vanishes in the earth, i.e., is integrated with our world. This hints methodologically at an incarnation, but psychologically it is the manifestation of an unconscious process in the sphere of consciousness. Speaking in the language of the dream, I would advise the dreamer to consider the universal fear of catastrophe in the light of his own death. In this connection, it is significant that the conjectured year of his death falls in the middle of the critical period, 1960 to 66. The end of the world would therefore be his own death, and hence primarily a personal catastrophe and a subjective end. But as the symbolism of the dream unmistakably portrays a collective situation, I think it would be better to generalize the subjective aspect of the UFO phenomenon and assume that a collective but unacknowledged fear of death that is being projected on UFOs. After the initial optimistic speculation about visitors from space, people have recently begun to discuss the possible dangerousness and the incalculable consequences of an invasion of Earth. Grounds for an unusually intense fear of death are nowadays not so far to seek. They are obvious enough, and more so as all life that is senselessly wasted and misdirected means death too. This may account for the unnatural intensification of the fear of death in our time, when life has lost its deeper meaning for so many people, forcing them to exchange the life-preserving rhythm of the aeons for the dread ticking of the clock. One would therefore wish many people the compensating attitude of the anima in our dream, and would recommend them to choose a motto like that of Hans Hofler, a pupil of Holbein, quote, "Death is where everything ends. I yield to none." Unquote. Dream 5. This dream comes from a woman with an academic education. It was dreamt several years ago without reference to UFOs. Two women were standing on the edge of the world seeking. The older woman was taller but lame. The younger was shorter and had her arm under that of the taller, as if supporting her. The older one looked out with courage. I identified her in some way with X. And the younger stood beside her with the strength but feared to look. Her head was bowed. I identified myself with the second figure. Above was the crescent moon and the morning star. To the right, the rising sun. An elliptical silvery object came flying from the right. It was peopled around its rim with figures, which I think were men, cloaked figures all silvery white. The women were awed and trembled in an unearthly cosmic space, a position untenable except at the moment of vision. End of dream. After this extraordinary impressive dream, the dreamer immediately seized a paintbrush in order to fix the vision, as shown in Plate 1. The dreamer describes a typical UFO phenomenon, which, like Dream 1, contains the motif manning, i.e. the presence of human beings. It obviously represents a borderline situation, as the expression on the edge of the world shows. Out beyond is cosmic space, with its planets and suns, or beyond may be the land of the dead or the unconscious. The first possibility suggests a spaceship, the technical achievement of more highly developed planetary beings. The second, angels of some kind or departed spirits who come to Earth in order to fetch a soul. This should refer to X, who was already in need of support as she was ill. Her health really did give grounds for anxiety, and in fact she died almost 2 years after the dream. Accordingly, the dreamer took it as a premonition. The third possibility, that the beyond is the unconscious, points to a personification of the latter, namely the Animus in his characteristic plurality. The festive white robes of the crew suggest the idea of a material union of opposites. This symbolism, as we know, also applies to death, as a final realization of wholeness. The dreamer's view that the dream gave warning of the death of her friend may therefore be right. The dream, then, uses the symbol of disc-like UFO manned by spirits, a spaceship that comes out of the beyond to the edge of the world in order to fetch the souls of the dead. It is not clear from the vision where the ship comes from, whether the sun or the moon or elsewhere. According to the myth, in the Arcta Archeli, it would be from the waxing moon, which increases in size according to the departed souls that are scooped up from the earth to the sun in 12 buckets, and from there are emptied into the moon in a purified state. The idea that the UFO might be some sort of Charon is certainly one that I have not met in literature before, or so far. This is hardly surprising, firstly because classical allusions of this sort are a rarity in people with modern education, and secondly because they might lead to very disagreeable conclusions. The apparent increase in UFO sightings in recent years has caused disquiet in the popular mind, and might easily give rise to the conclusion that, if so many spaceships appear from beyond, a corresponding number of deaths may be expected. We know that such phenomena were interpreted like this in earlier centuries. They were portents of a great dying, of war and pestilence, like the dark premonitions that underlie our modern fear. One ought not to assume that the great masses are so enlightened that hypotheses of this kind can no longer take root. The Middle Ages, antiquity, and prehistory have not died out, as the enlightened suppose, but live on merrily in large sections of the population. Mythology and magic flourish as ever in our midst, and are unknown only to those whose rationalistic education has alienated them from their roots. Footnote. And so he says, Jaffe's, and then there's the title of the book, which investigates strange occurrences among modern people for their mythological content. And a footnote. Quite apart from the ecclesiastical symbolism that embodies 6,000 years of spiritual development and constantly renews itself, there are also in more disreputable relatives magical ideas and practices which are still very much alive in spite of all education and enlightenment. One must have lived for many years in the Swiss countryside in order to become acquainted with this background, for it never appears on the surface, but once you have found the key, you stagger from one amazement to the next. Not only do you come across the primitive witch doctor in the guise of the so-called strudel wizard, you also find blood packs with the devil, pin stickings, and spells for drying up the milk of cattle, and regular handwritten books of magic. At the house of one of these rustic wizards, I once discovered a book of this kind from the end of the 19th century, beginning with the Mittersburg magic spell in modern High German and an incantation to Venus of unknown age. These wizards often have a large clientele from town and country. I myself have seen a collection of hundreds of letters of thanks, which one of them received for successfully laying ghosts in houses and stables, for taking the curse off men and animals, and for curing all manner of ailments. For those of my readers who are unaware of these things and think I am exaggerating, I can point to the easily verifiable fact that the heyday of astrology was not in the benighted Middle Ages, but in the middle of the 20th century, when even the newspapers do not hesitate to publish the week's horoscope. A thin layer of rootless rationalists read with satisfaction in the encyclopedia that in the year 1723 Mr. So-and-so had horoscopes cast for his children, and yet do not know that nowadays the horoscope has almost attained the rank of a visiting card. Those who have even a nodding acquaintance with this background and are in any way affected by it, obey the unwritten but strictly observed convention, quote, "One does not speak of such things," unquote. They are only whispered about. No one admits them, for no one wants to be considered all that stupid. In reality, however, it is very different. I mention these things that infest the roots of our society chiefly on account of the symbolism of our dreams, which sounds so incomprehensible to many people because it is based on historical and contemporary facts that are unknown to them. What would they say if I connected the dream of a quiet, simple person with Wotan or Balder? They would accuse me of learned eccentricity, not knowing that in the same village there was a wizard who had taken the spell off the dreamer's stable, using for that purpose a book of magic that begins with the Mittersburg incantation. Anyone who does not know that the Wotan's host, enlightened or no enlightenment, still roams about our Swiss cantons, would accuse me of great whimsicality if I referred to the anxiety dream of a city dweller on the lonely Alp to the blessed people, the dead, and yet when he is surrounded by mountain folk for whom the Dogoli, a Swiss-German expression for the nightmare or stable spook, and Wotan's nightly cavalcade are a reality which they fear without admitting it and profess to know nothing about. It needs so little to bridge the apparent abyss that yawns between the prehistoric world and the present. Our identity with the fleeting consciousness of the present is, however, so great that we may forget the timelessness of our psychic foundations. Everything that has lasted longer and will last longer than the whirligig of modern political moments is regarded as fantastical nonsense that should studiously be avoided. But in that way we succumb to the greatest psychic danger that now threatens us, rootless intellectualism, which one and all reckon without their host, i.e., without the real person. Unfortunately, people imagine that not only the things they are conscious of affect them, and that for everything unknown there is some specialist who has long made a science out of it. This delusion is the more plausible in that nowadays it really has become impossible for an individual to assimilate the things which specialists know about and they don't. But since, subjectively, the most effective experiences are the most individual and therefore the most improbable, the questioner will often get no very satisfactory answer from the scientist. A typical example of this is Menzel's book on the UFOs. The scientist's interest is too easily restricted to the common, the probable, the average, so that it is after all the basis of every empirical science. Nevertheless, a basis has little meaning unless something can be erected upon it that also leaves room for the exceptional and extraordinary. In a borderline situation such as our dream describes, we may expect something extraordinary, or rather, what seems extraordinary to us, though in reality it has always been inherent in such situations. The ship of death approaches with a corona of departed spirits. The deceased joins their company, and the multitudinous dead take the soul with them. When archetypical ideas of this kind appear, they invariably signify something unusual. It is not our interpretation that is far-fetched. It is merely that the dreamer's attention, caught by the many superficial aspects of the dream, has missed the main point, namely the nearness of death, which in a sense concerns her as much as her friend. We have met the motif of the manning of the spaceship in the dream of the metallic spider, and shall meet it again in the next one. The instinctive resistance we feel for the deeper aspect of this motif may explain why it seems to play no role in the UFO literature. We might exclaim with Faust, "Summon not the well-known throng!" But there is no need of this summons, because the fear that hangs over the world has already taken care of it. Dream 6. The following dream, footnote, I am indebted to Dr. H.Y. Kluger, Los Angeles, for this material, comes from California, the classic saucer country, so to speak. The dreamer is a young woman of 23. The dream. I am standing outside with someone, a man. It was night time, and we seemed to be in the square or the center of town, a circle. We are watching the sky. All of a sudden, I saw something round and fluorescent coming towards us from way in the distance. I realized it was a flying saucer. I thought it was a ridiculous joke. It got larger and larger, as if it was coming towards us. It was a huge round circle of light. Finally, it covered the entire sky. It was so close I could see figures walking back and forth on the walk around the ship. There was a railing around it. I thought someone was playing a trick, and then I thought it was real. I looked up behind me and saw someone with a movie projector, and the back of it seemed to be a building, like a hotel. These people were high up and projecting the image onto the sky. I told everyone. Then I seemed to be in a sort of studio. There were two producers, competitors, both old men. I kept going from one to the other, discussing my part in their picture. There were many girls involved. One of the producers was directing this flying saucer thing. They were both making science fiction films, and I was going to have a lead in both pictures. The dreamer, this is the end of the dream, the dreamer, a young actress, was undergoing psychological treatment for a marked disassociation of personality with all the accompanying symptoms. As usual, the disassociation expressed itself in her relationship with the opposite sex, that is, in a conflict between two men who corresponded to two incompatible halves of her personality. Commentary to Dream 6. As in the first two dreams, the dreamer was conscious of UFOs, and here, as there, the UFOs function as a symbol carrier. Its appearance is even expected, since the dreamer has already put herself in the central position for this purpose, a square or center of the city. This gives her a central position because of the opposites, equidistant from right and left, allowing her to see or feel both sides. In light of this attitude, the UFO appears to be rather like exemplification or projection of it. The dreamer insists on the projection character of the UFO, since it proves to be a cinematographic operation conducted by two rival film producers. We can easily discern in these two figures the rival objects of her dissociative love choice, and hence the underlying conflict, which should be resolved in reconciliation of opposites. The UFOs appear here to be the mediating role we have met before, but it turns out to be an intentional cinematographic effect, obviously lacking any reconciling significance. If we remember the important part a film producer plays in the life of a young actress, then the changing of the two rival lovers into producers suggests that the latter have acquired for her a more exalted rank or an increase in prestige. They have, so to speak, moved into the limelight of her own drama, whereas the UFO is as much very dimmed, if it had not lost its significance altogether, as a mere trick. The accent has gone over entirely to the producers. The apparently cosmic phenomenon is nothing more than a meaningless trick staged by them, and the dreamer's interest turns wholly to her professional ambition. This seals the outcome of the solution offered by the dream. It is not easy to see why the dream brings in the UFO at all, only to dispose of it in this disappointing way. In view of the suggestive circumstances at the beginning of the dream, center and circular square, and the sensational significance of UFOs, obviously well known to the dreamer, this dénouement is rather unexpected. It is as though the dream wanted to say, "It's not like that at all, on the contrary. It is only a film trick, a bit of science fiction. Think, rather, that you have the chief role in the two pictures." From this we can see what the role intended for the UFOs and why it had to disappear from the scene. The personality of the dreamer takes up a central position on the stage, one that compensates the splitting into opposites, and therefore a means of overcoming the disassociation. For this, a powerful effect is needed in order to enforce a consistent attitude. In the effect of the pendulum movement of autonomous opposites ceases and a uniform state is produced. This is accomplished by the exciting appearance of the UFO, which for a moment attracts all attention to itself. It is clear that the UFO phenomenon in this dream is unreal and only a means to an end, as though one called out to a person, "Look out!" That is why it is immediately devalued. It is not a genuine phenomenon at all, but a trick, and the dream action now proceeds to the personal problem of the dreamer and her conflict between two men. In this well-known and very common situation, if this well-known and very common situation means more and lasts longer than any passing uncertainty of choice, this is usually due to the fact that the problem is not taken seriously, like Buridian's ass, which could not decide which of two bundles of hay it wanted to eat first. It was an artificial problem. In reality, he was not hungry. This seems to be the case with our dreamer. She means neither one nor the other, but herself. What she really wants is told to her by the dream, which changes the lovers into producers, represents the situation as a film project, and gives her the chief role in the pictures. That is what the dreamer really intends. In the interest of her profession, she wants to play the chief role, that of the young lover, regardless of any partner. But evidently she cannot quite bring it off in reality, because she is still tempted to regard her partners as real, when in fact they are only playing a role in her own drama. This does not speak very well for her artistic vocation, and she is right to feel some doubt to its seriousness for her. In contradistinction to her vacillating conscious attitude, the dream points decidedly to her profession as her true love, and thus gives her the solution to her conflict. Any insight into the nature of the UFO phenomenon is not to be expected from this dream. The UFO is used only as a sort of alarm signal, thanks to the collective excitement occasioned by flying saucers. Interesting or alarming as the phenomenon may be, young people have, or claim, the right to regard the problem as her and him as much more fascinating. In this case, the young woman was certainly right, for one is still in the process of development. The earth and its laws are of more significance than the message resounding from afar, which the signals in heaven proclaim. Since youth lasts for a very long time, and its peculiar state of mind is the highest that many humans' lives attain, this psychological limitation is equally true for the gray-haired, whose birthdays are nothing more than nostalgic celebrations of their 20th. At best, the outcome is concentration on one's profession, any further development being regarded as a mere disturbance. Neither age nor position nor education is any protection against this psychological standstill. Human society is, after all, still very young, for what are 3,000 to 5,000 years on a longer view? I have introduced the stream as a paradigm of the way the unconscious can deal with the problems that concern us here. I wanted to show that the symbols cannot be interpreted in a uniform manner, and that their meaning depends on many different factors. Life cannot go forward except from the place from where one happens to be. In the next section, I shall discuss some pictures related to the UFOs. The painter of the fire sower, to whom I have written with certain details, seems to be connected with the strange apparitions in the skies sent me in the following dream, which he had on September 12th, 1957. Okay, this is the last dream for this chapter. Dream 7. I found myself, together with other people, on top of the hill, looking over a beautiful, broad, undulating landscape teeming with lush verdure. Suddenly a flying saucer floated into view, pausing at my eye level before us, and lay there, clear and shining, in the sunlight. It did not look like a machine, but like a deep-sea fish, round and flat and enormously big, about 30 to 40 feet in diameter. It was speckled all over with gray, blue, and white spots. Its edges undulated and quivered all the time, and they acted as oars and rudders. The creature began circling around, then all at once, as though fired from a cannon, shot straight out into the blue sky, came rushing down again with inconceivable speed, and once more circled round our hill. It was obviously doing this for our benefit. Once, when it flew quite close, it seemed to be much smaller, and looked like a hammerhead shark. Now it had somehow landed in our vicinity. An occupant got out and came straight towards me, a semi-human woman. The other people fled and waited at a respectful distance, looking back at us. The woman told me that they knew me well in that other world from which she had come, and was watching how I fulfilled my task, my mission. She spoke in a stern, almost threatening tone, and seemed to attach great importance to the charge laid upon me. Commentary to Dream 7. The occasion for the dream was the anticipation of a visit which the dreamer intended to pay me during the next few days. The exposition showed a positive, hopeful feeling of expectancy. The dramatic development begins with the sudden appearance of a UFO, which has the obvious intention of showing itself as clearly as possible to the observer. On closer inspection, he sees that it is not a machine, but an animal of sorts, a deep-sea fish, something like a giant ray, which, as we know, sometimes make attempts to fly. Its movements emphasize the relationship of the UFO to the observers. These overtures lead to a landing. A semi-human figure climbs out of the UFOs, thus revealing an intelligent human relationship between the UFO and its observers. This impression is strengthened by the fact that it is a feminine figure, which, because it is unknown and indefinite, belongs to the Anima type. The numinosity of this archetype causes a panic reaction among the people present. In other words, the dreamer registers a subjective reaction of flight. The reason for this lies in the fateful significance of the Anima figure. She is the Sphinx of Oedipus, a Cassandra, the messenger of the Grail, the white lady who gives warning of death, etc. This view is borne out by the message she conveys. She comes from another world where the dreamer is known and where they have been attentively watching how he fulfills his, quote, mission, unquote. The Anima personifies the collective unconsciousness. The unconscious, sorry. Footnote. When the shadow, the inferior personality, is the large measure unconscious, the unconscious is represented by a masculine figure. So, go back. The Anima personifies the collective unconscious, the realm of mothers, which, as experience shows, has a distinctive tendency to influence the conscious conduct of life and, when this is not possible, to erupt violently into consciousness in order to confront it with strange and seemingly incomprehensible contents. The UFO in the dream is a content of this kind whose strangeness leaves nothing to be desired. The difficulty of integration in this case so great that the dreamer's ordinary powers of comprehension fail him, and he resorts to mythical means of explanation, star-dwellers, angels, spirits, gods, even before he knows what he has seen. So great is the numinosity of this idea that one never asks oneself whether it might be a subjective perception of collective unconscious process. For in the common estimation, a subjective observation can only be either true or else, as a delusion of the senses or a hallucination, it can only be untrue. The fact that the latter are also true phenomena with sufficient reason of their own is apparently never taken into account, so long as no obvious pathology disturbance is present. There are, however, manifestations of the unconscious, even in normal people, which can be so quote-unquote real and impressive that the observer indistinctly resists taking their perception as a delusion or hallucination. Their instinct is right. When the inner process cannot be integrated, it is often projected outwards. It is, indeed, the rule that a person's consciousness projects all perceptions coming from the feminine personification. So a man's consciousness, it is the rule, indeed the rule, that a man's consciousness projects all perceptions coming from the feminine personification of the unconscious onto an anima figure, i.e. a real woman, to whom he is as much bound as he is in reality to the contents of the unconscious. This explains the fateful quality of the anima, which is also suggested by the dream in her question. How are you fulfilling your life's task, mission, your raison d'être, the meaning and purpose of your existence? This is the question of individuation, the most fateful of all questions, which was put to Oedipus in the form of the childish riddle of the Sphinx, and was radically misunderstood by him. Can one imagine an intelligent Athenian playgoer ever being taken by the terrible riddles of the Sphinx? Oedipus did not use his intelligence to see through the uncanny nature of this childishly simple and all too facile riddle, and therefore fell victim to his tragic fate, because he thought he had answered the question. It was the Sphinx itself that he ought to have answered, and not its facade. Just as Mephistopheles proved to be the quintessence of the poodle, so the anima is the quintessence of the UFO. But Mephistopheles is not the whole of Faust, and the anima, too, is only a part of the whole, which is obscurely alluded to in the deep-sea fish, the rotundum. Here the anima plays the role of the mediatrix between the unconscious and the conscious, a dual figure like the Sphinx, compounded of an animal instinct body and specifically human qualities head. In her body lie the forces that determine man's fate, and in her head the power to modify them intelligently. The basic idea is also reflected in the picture we shall reproduce later. At this point, the dream sparks a mythical language that makes use of conceptions of another world and of angelic beings who watch the doings of people. This vividly expresses the symbiosis of consciousness and unconsciousness. Such, at any rate, would seem to be the nearest we can get to a satisfactory explanation. With regard to the possible metaphysical background, we must honestly confess our ignorance and impossibility of proof. The unmistakable tendency of the dream is the attempt to create a psychologium which we meet again and again in this and many other forms, regardless of whether the UFOs should be understood as concrete realities or as subjective phenomena. The psychologium is a reality in its own right. It is based on a real perception, which has no need of the physical reality of UFOs, because it manifested itself long before UFOs were ever heard of. The end of the dream lays special weight on the woman's message, emphasizing its seriousness, even its menacing quality. The collective parallel to this is the widespread fear that UFOs may not be harmless after all, and that communication with other planets might have unpredictable consequences. This view is supported by the fact that the suppression of the certain information by the American authorities cannot be regulated entirely in the realm of fable. The seriousness, indeed dangerousness, of the problem of individuation cannot be denied in an age when the destructive effects of mass-mindedness are so deeply apparent, for individuation is a great alternative that faces our Western civilization. It is a fact that in a dictator state the individual is robbed of their freedom, and that we too are threatened by this political development and are not at all sure of its right means of defense. Hence the question arises in all urgency: are we going to let ourselves be robbed of our individual freedom, and what can we do to stop it? Anxiously we look around for collective measures, thereby reinforcing the very mass-mindedness we want to fight against. This is only one remedy for the leveling effect of all collective measures, and that is to emphasize and increase the value of the individual. A fundamental change of attitude, metanoia, is required, a real recognition of the whole person. This can only be the business of the individual, and it must begin with the individual in order to be real. This is the message of our dream, a message addressed to the dreamer from the collective, instinctual foundations of humanity. Large political and social organizations must not be ends in themselves, and merely temporary expedients. Just as it was felt necessary in America to break up their great trusts, so the destruction of huge organization will eventually prove to be a necessity, because, like a cancerous growth, they eat away man's nature as soon as they become ends in themselves and attain authority. From that moment they grow beyond people and escape their control. One becomes their victim and is sacrificed to the madness of an idea that knows no master. All great organizations in which individuals no longer count are exposed to this danger. There seems to be only one way of countering the threat to our lives, and that is the revaluation of the individual. So vitally important a measure cannot, however, be put into effect at will, that is, by planning and insight, because the individual human being is too small and weak. What is needed rather is an involuntary faith, a kind of metaphysical command, which no one can manufacture artificially with their own will and understanding. It can only come about spontaneously. One such dominant underlies our dreams. My suggestion that certain details of the picture might be connected with the UFO problem was sufficient to constellate in the dreamer the archetype underlying this collective phenomenon and give him a numinous insight into the metaphysical significance of the individual. The empirical person extends beyond their conscious boundaries. Their life and fate have far more than a personal meaning. The one attracts the interest of another world. Achievements are expected of them which go beyond this empirical realm and its narrow limits. The status of the individual is enhanced, and they acquire a cosmic importance. This numinous transformation is not the result of conscious intention or intellectual conviction, but is brought about by the impact of overwhelming archetypal impressions. As experience of this kind is not without its dangers, because it often has an inflating effect on the individual. One's ego fancies itself increased and exalted, whereas in reality it is thrust into the background. In fact, the ego almost needs an inflation, a feeling of being one with the elect, for instance, in order not to lose ground from under its feet, although it is precisely the inflation that lifts it off its foundations. It is not the ego that is exalted, rather something greater than it makes its appearance, the self, a symbol that expresses the whole of people. But ego loves to think itself the whole of people, and therefore has the greatest difficulty in avoiding the danger of inflation. This is another reason why such experiences are shunned, indeed feared as pathological, and why the very idea of the unconscious and any preoccupation with it is unwelcome. It is not so long ago that we were living in a primitive state of mind, with its quotes, perils of the soul, loss of soul, states of possession, etc., which threatened the unity of the personality, that is, the ego. These dangers are still a long way from having been overcome in our civilized society. Though they no longer affect the individual to the same degree, this is certainly not true of society or national groups on a large scale, as contemporary history shows only too clearly. They are psychic epidemics that destroy the individual. In face of this danger, the only thing that helps is for the individual to be seized by a powerful emotion, which, instead of suppressing or destroying them, makes them whole. This can only happen when the unconscious person is added to the conscious one. The process of unification is only partly under the control of our will, for the rest of it happens involuntarily. With the conscious mind, we are able, at most, to get within reach of the unconscious process, and must then wait and see what will happen next. From the conscious standpoint, the whole process looks like an adventure or a quest, somewhere in the middle of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Esther Hardley, in a detailed study, footnote, The Journey into Self, end of footnote, has shown that in spite of the differences of language and outlet, Bunyan was speaking of the same invalid expectations which also befall people today when they choose that straight and narrow path. I would recommend her book to anyone who wants to know what the individuation process really is. To the constantly reiterated question, what can I do? I know no other answer except become what you have always been, namely the wholeness with which you have lost in the middle of our civilized conscious existence, a wholeness which we always were without knowing it. Esther Harding's book speaks with such a simple and universal language that any man of good will, even though he lacks specialized knowledge, can get an idea of what it's all about. He will also understand why, despite the fact that his question, why on earth am I in the present threatening world situation with all my feeble powers, seems so important to him. It were better for him to do nothing and to leave things as they are. To worship collective ideals and work with the big organizations is spectacularly meritorious, but they nevertheless dig the grave for the individual. A group is always of less value than the average run of its members, and when the group consists in the main of shrinkers and good-for-nothings, what then? Then the ideals it preaches count for nothing too. Also, the right means in the hands of the wrong person works the wrong way, as a Chinese proverb informs us. The message which the UFOs brings to the dreamer is a time problem that concerns us all. The signs appear in the heavens so that everyone shall see them. They bid each of us remember their own soul and their own wholeness, because this is the answer the West should give to the danger of mass-mindedness.